J.R.R. Tolkien is generally seen as the founder of the fantasy genre. His immensely detailed world of Middle-earth first entered print in 1937 with the children's book The Hobbit. But this only gave readers a small taste of what was to come in the epic Lord of the Rings trilogy published in the mid-50s. This series is a masterpiece of literature, and more importantly, it is proved to be an absolute cash cow. This got publishers' attention, and starting in the late 70s, they decided to get some of that money for themselves by pushing out their own book series with the same plotline where a group of heroes go on an epic quest to save their magical faux medieval world from an evil Dark Lord. Fantasy became a fully fledged genre that had its own section at the bookstore, and to a casual observer, it seemed to be made up entirely of slight variations on the exact same story. Then, in response to this, there were, of course, the anti-Tolkiens, who wrote fantasy books that rejected this formula, that tried to get as far away from the Lord of the Rings as possible. But even then, as Terry Pratchett famously observed, the fact that it was considered subversive to tell fantasy not modeled after Tolkien tells you all you need to know about the magnitude of his influence. Speaking today in the 2020s, we've moved on quite a bit. If you go to the fantasy section in any bookstore, you'll find a pretty diverse array of stories. But I'm still willing to bet that when you think of fantasy, you have a very specific vision involving elves and dwarves and orcs. The type of fantasy you'd expect in a module of the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, which is probably the main propagator today of what we think of as Tolkien-esque fantasy. But all of this opens up a question. If we look at the typical timeline of fantasy, well, there's lots of things we could pick apart, but for the sake of this video, let's go to the beginning before the beginning. We give Tolkien a lot of credit as the father of fantasy, but was there anyone before him who had the same idea of telling stories set in a magical, invented world? Without the template set by Tolkien to guide them, what sort of bizarre, imaginative stories did they come up with? Or we might find that many of the tropes that we associate with Tolkien are older than we typically assume. When I began looking into this, I found that there's a lot more out there than I had initially anticipated, and it's quite difficult to categorize it all. A question like, what was the first fantasy story, might seem simple, but it really depends on what definitions you're using. Tales about magic, monsters, epic quests, and over-the-top heroes are about as old as humanity itself. Granted, these myths and legends were generally meant to be interpreted as historical accounts of actual events. But there's also plenty of stories that were clearly presented as fiction. Take, for example, Lucian's A True History from the 2nd century, which is a satirical traveler's tale where the narrator journeys into outer space and gets caught up in a war between the inhabitants of the sun and the moon. Or Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene from the late 1500s, an epic poem declaiming the deeds of virtuous knights in the magical kingdom of the fairies. It's only in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries that it becomes firmly established that respectable fiction should take the form of realistic novels that reflect everyday life. And it's only there that we can truly identify fantasy as a distinctive tendency that refuses to conform to this norm, and instead harkens back to the older, more romantic era of literature. During this time, there was Gothic horror, about the supernatural intruding into the ordinary world, and there was also Orientalist fantasy and Lost World fiction that played off European audiences' idea of foreign lands as magical and dangerous places ripe for adventure. But these stories still took place in specific locations at specific points in time in our own world, which is very different from the type of fantasy that we associate with Tolkien, the type that immerses the reader in an entirely new setting invented by the author. For that type of story, some of the earliest clear examples come from the realm of children's literature. Sarah Coleridge's Phantasmian in 1837 builds off the existing tradition of fairy tales set in vague, far-off lands, and tells of the journeys of a young prince through various invented kingdoms. And over the course of the century, we'd also get classics like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland or The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. But children's fantasy is something that we usually see as its own separate category. These books may be predecessors to The Hobbit, but if we want something that's comparable to The Lord of the Rings, we should be looking for fantasy that's set in its own secondary world and which is written for an adult audience. And so I ran out to read as many books as I could find which meet these criteria and were written before the publication of The Lord of the Rings in 1954. As we'll see, there's a bit of debate over what's included in the category of secondary world fantasy, but being generous, I ended up including about 40 different books by around 20 different authors, along with quite a few short stories in old magazines. If you want to have a read of these yourself before you hear what I have to say, I have included a bibliography in the description of this video, which also includes all of the sources that I used for research. This is a lot to go over, and because the script ended up running around 40,000 words, I decided to split this video in two. This part will focus on what I call literary fantasy. These are novels primarily written in the United Kingdom, and all of which can be regarded as somewhat avant-garde. Setting your story in an invented world is an unusual idea, and as we'll see, the people who did it were usually quite unusual themselves. The second part will cover pulp fantasy, which mainly comprises short stories published in magazines in the United States. These were generally regarded as more lowbrow, but as we'll see, they played an overlooked but incredibly important role in shaping the fantasy genre as we know it today. Also, be aware that spoilers will abound for just about every story I talk about, though none of these books rely overmuch on plot twists, so I don't think that knowing the ending beforehand will negatively impact your enjoyment should you go and seek it out yourself. If you start at the most basic level and type first fantasy novel into Google, your top result will probably be Phantasties, which was a novel written in 1858 by George MacDonald. Now, MacDonald was a Victorian-era Scotsman who had originally studied theology and served as a Congregationalist minister. However, his belief in universal salvation ran directly counter to the church's Calvinist doctrine, and he soon found himself out of the job. He turned to writing and became best known for his fairy tales for children. But he also wrote a couple of fantasy novels intended for adults, starting in 1858 with Phantasties, or it might be pronounced Phantastes or Phantast. As far as I can tell, there's no consensus. It's been argued that Phantasties is significant, as it is the first fantasy book written for adults which is set in an invented world. And in a loose sense, I guess it does fulfill those criteria. The story follows a young man named Onodos, who on his 21st birthday is pulled from our world into fairyland, where he is roped into various adventures. But if you read the book with the expectation that it'll be something in the same vein as The Lord of the Rings, you'll end up confused and disappointed. Fairyland, as MacDonald writes it, isn't a fully realized world in the same way as Tolkien's Middle-earth. There's no sense that it's a place with its own history and geography. It's more of a dreamlike state where Onodos is randomly thrust from one fantastical fairy tale-like situation to another. In one chapter, he's hanging out with some nature spirits. In another chapter, he's enlisted by a group of knights to help slay a giant. In another chapter, which is the longest chapter in the entire book, he wanders into a library and reads a completely unrelated story about a man in Prague with a magic mirror. The closest thing to an overarching plotline has to do with his attempts to woo the Marble Lady, who, like most characters in fantasies, doesn't really have a name or a backstory or a personality, but exists as an abstract symbol. And that is the crux of it. MacDonald's goal with fantasies, and with Lilith, the other novel he wrote with a similar structure, is for the reader to interpret the events symbolically, to use them to realize deeper truths. Specifically, for him, it all comes back to his heterodox theology. MacDonald believed in the potential for stories like this to promote introspection and allow one to become closer to God. But as a result of this, there's no sense that the story takes place in an internally consistent world that exists for its own sake, which is the central conceit of modern fantasy, and that puts us on shaky ground if we want to put forth George MacDonald as the founder of the genre. And so, within the niche community of people who care about pre-Tolkien fantasy, many prefer to start the timeline with a different Victorian author. William Morris was a moderately prominent public figure whose various ventures all revolved around his obsession with the Middle Ages. He made his living running a business that sold handcrafted furniture and decorative items in ornate, archaic styles as a rejection of mechanized manufacturing. He was a critic of industrial capitalism and promoted an idiosyncratic vision of socialism modeled after the medieval guild system. He produced English-language translations of classical and medieval stories, and then, towards the end of his life, he decided to pass the time by writing his own novels after the style of medieval romances. He began with historical fiction about Germanic tribes facing invasion by the Romans and the Huns. But as he went on, his narratives became more and more fantastical. If you take a read of any of these books, the first thing you'll notice is that Morris does his best to imitate a medieval writing style. His stories are full of archaic diction and are told in a rather slow and meandering style. If you're one of the people who finds The Lord of the Rings difficult to read, be warned that William Morris is at an entirely different level. But if you're willing to brave it, what you'll typically find is the story of a young male protagonist journeying through various fictional medieval kingdoms with one or two magical elements thrown into the mix, plus a pinch of left-wing social commentary. In The Wood Beyond the World, for instance, our hero Walter is shipwrecked in a mysterious land where he ends up in a situationship with a malevolent sorceress referred to as the Lady, and this is made all the more complicated by the presence of a cruel prince referred to as the King's Son, and by the Lady's two servants, the innocent maid and the dwarf. This dwarf has little in common with what we know in modern fantasy, and is presented as a pathetic and rather bestial creature that eats raw flesh. But eventually, Walter and the maid form a relationship, and the two of them run off together. After a brief stint where the maid is proclaimed to be a god by a group of barbarians called the Bear People, they make it to the land of Starkwall, where due to incredible luck, Walter fulfills the criteria for an arcane tradition that leads to him being crowned king, and in this role, he orders that his thanes open the prison doors and feed the needy and clothe them, and make good cheer to all men, high and low, rich and unrich. In Morris's more substantial and more meandering novel, The Well at the World's End, we follow Prince Ralph as he journeys from his humble kingdom of Upmeads to make his fortune in the wider world. This doesn't go very well for him, as it turns out that in sharp contrast to the small, relatively egalitarian kingdom of Upmeads from which he hails, the neighboring lands are militant slave societies where might makes right. But after a series of setbacks, he and his ladylove Ursula engage on a quest to drink from the Well at the World's End, which is at multiple points throughout the book written out in all caps. The exact properties and history of this well are never clearly explained, but we are told that it grants youth and long life, and after drinking from it, Ralph and Ursula return to Upmeads and reign long as king and queen. William Morris's romances are often touted as the earliest examples of high fantasy taking place in its own secondary world. But once again, things aren't quite so simple. If you pay attention, it's pretty clear that while these novels take place in fictional kingdoms, they are still meant to be interpreted as existing within real-world medieval Europe. The characters are explicitly Christian. They make references to real-world saints, real-world holidays, and real-world locations like the city of Rome. By contrast, we normally think of secondary world fantasy as fantasy that takes place in its own universe, completely separate from our own. But I should note that if we applied that standard too strictly, we would end up excluding Middle-earth itself, which Tolkien stated was simply an ancient version of our own Earth in the mythic past. Yet, it's also undeniable that Tolkien is more ambitious than Morris. His Legendaria might technically take place on our own Earth, but it's in a time so distant to be utterly unrecognizable, with completely different geography, culture, religion, and customs. When you read it, it's clear that he's creating something new, but most people in the 1890s reading Morris's works wouldn't have seen them as the invention of a new fantastical genre, but simply a pastiche of the old medieval romances. And so, you can make all sorts of arguments over who we should regard as the first fantasy author, William Morris or George MacDonald, or maybe you think that the title belongs to someone even earlier than them, or to one of the later writers that we're about to discuss. But at the very least, Morris and MacDonald are both pioneers in the style that would later evolve into fantasy as we know it today, and one of the people who enjoyed their work was a young man named J.R.R. Tolkien, who freely admitted that when he was a child, the fairy tales of George MacDonald were among the first stories to spark his imagination, and that the romances of William Morris were foremost on his mind when he began writing his own fiction. But there's still plenty more ground to cover before we get to that point. There be islands in the central sea, whose waters are bounded by no shore, and where no ships come. This is the faith of their people. In the mist before the beginning, fate and chance cast lots to decide whose the game should be. And he that won strode through the mist to Manayud Shashai, and said, "Now make gods for me, for I have won the cast, and the game is to be mine." Who it was that won the cast, and whether it was fate or whether chance that went through the mist before the beginning to Manayud Shashai, none knoweth. Edward John Moreton Drax Plunkett was the hereditary Baron of Dunsany, which is a castle in what's today the Republic of Ireland. Similar to William Morris, he needed a hobby to keep himself busy, so in 1905, under the title of Lord Dunsany, he published a short book called The Gods of Pegana. What follows here, and in the sequel, Time and the Gods, is an invented mythology telling of how Manawydh Sheshai created the small gods, of how Skarl the drummer lulled him to sleep, of how the small gods from their abode in Pegana created the worlds, of all the ways that they deal capriciously with humanity, and of how, when Manawydh Sheshai inevitably awakens, he will be displeased by all of this, and he will unmake the worlds and the gods in order to start anew. This mythology isn't told as a continuous narrative, but rather as a series of vignettes, each one either describing the doings of one of the gods, or the ways in which humanity tries to make sense of this world. There's a certain sense of whimsy about these stories, but they're also told in an elevated prose style reminiscent of the King James Bible, which grants a certain epic quality, and this combines to form a rather unique mood that's hard to pin down. Once, as Mung went his way athwart the earth, and up and down its cities and across its plains, Mung came upon a man who was afraid when Mung said, "I am Mung." And Mung said, "Were the 40 million years before thy coming intolerable to thee?" And Mung said, "Not less tolerable to thee shall be the 40 million years to come." Then Mung made against him the sign of Mung, and the life of the man was fettered no longer with hands and feet. Bathos is the term when a piece of media juxtaposes something dramatic with something comedic. But this term specifically refers to a phenomenon where the humor undermines the drama, resulting in something that's utterly ridiculous. But with Dunsany's prose, the two moods coexist harmoniously, and if anything, it's the drama that comes out on top. You're more likely to finish a Dunsany story with chills going down your spine than you are to be laughing at it. The whole effect is highly unusual, and it truly feels as if you're reading the myths of a people who don't actually exist. This is aided by the fact that Dunsany has a particular talent for coming up with fantastical names. In this mythos, we have deities like Dorojan, the god of destiny, Inzana, the Dawnchild, the rock god Yarnizai, along with locations like Sardathrion, Harza, and Runazard. There's no actual linguistic formula behind these names. Dunsany's just mashing different syllables together, but he still shows a level of inventiveness for which his contemporaries lacked much of a frame for reference. However, they generally saw his fantasies as fitting into one tendency that was quite popular at the time, Orientalism. This is a term for European art and literature characterized by a fascination with the exotic East, especially but not exclusively Arabia and Iran. In the modern day, the term is almost always used with negative connotations, as these works rely heavily on stereotypes. They ignore the complex realities of the places they represent in favor of a simplified abstraction that will excite European audiences. Dunsany's settings and mythology, again, isn't clearly modeled after any single real-world culture, but it plays into all of the tropes of Orientalism. He essentially creates an amalgamation of all of the things that his audience would imagine when they think of the exotic East, a strange, magical world that is on one hand whimsical and a bit ridiculous, but on the other hand has within it some deep wisdom for which you can't help but feel reverence. But in setting his stories in this invented world, Dunsany gives up on pretending that this archetype is representative of anywhere in the real world, that is to say, the actual East. But rather, he admits that it is a romanticized ideal that only exists in his own imagination. You can argue over what sort of moral judgment we should give to this pseudo-Orientalism, but Dunsany kept at it. He moved past the setting of Pegana to publish many more books of fantastical short stories, along with several stage plays. There's almost always some pretense that these stories are meant to be interpreted as taking place somewhere in our own world, but usually it's nowhere that you can place on a map. They're stated to take place in the third hemisphere, or beyond the fields we know, an uncharted land of monsters, magic, and myth. We hear, for instance, of King Argomenes, who has been reduced to slavery by the usurper Darniak, but reclaims his throne after a mysterious spirit helps him unearth an ancient sword. We hear of the exploits of Thangobrine the Jeweler, to whom a merchant prince offers his daughter's soul in return for stealing the dead man's diamond from the temple of the spider god Hlothl. We hear of the town of Alathurion, which is menaced by the satanic warlock Gaznak, who comes to Earth every 230 years on a comet, and can only be defeated with the sword Sachnoth, which lies in the spinal column of the metallic crocodile dragon Tara-Gavarug. None of these stories had the same mass-market appeal or cultural staying power as The Lord of the Rings later would, but Dunsany still had his share of admirers. In his castle, he hung out with the likes of H.G. Wells, Rudyard Kipling, and George Bernard Shaw, and also formed a bitter rivalry with William Butler Yeats. Plays that he wrote were regularly performed on Broadway, and Dunsanian popped up as an adjective when describing highly imaginative and fantastical works of fiction. And from a few scattered references in his letters, we do know that J.R.R. Tolkien was familiar with Dunsany's stories. Sometimes people will extrapolate this and say that Dunsany was one of his major influences, but I'm skeptical of this claim. It's hard to point at anything in Tolkien's work that seems like it was based on any of Dunsany's stories, and if anything, the two of them stand out more as polar opposites in the way they approach fantasy. Almost everything that Tolkien wrote is part of a single legendarium. He was an obsessive world builder, and his stories mainly serve as a vessel for exploring different aspects of Middle-earth's history and mythology. By contrast, Dunsany cared much less about keeping track of the lore of his settings. The Gods of Pegana is a very different type of book from Tolkien's Silmarillion. There's no maps or pronunciation guides or family trees or appendices of any kind. Dunsany is much more focused on creating a sense of magical whimsy than he is on any form of verisimilitude. As others have commented, it's emblematic of his writing that Pegana has a god of dust, a god of silence, a god of little dreams and fancies, but not, say, a god of the harvest. However, to describe Dunsany as a poor world builder doesn't feel quite right. There is something very distinctive and memorable about the way he builds his settings, and I feel like the best way to articulate this is to borrow the concept of hard and soft world building from Tim Hickson of the YouTube channel Hello Future Me. Under this framework, world building in general is the art of making the audience feel immersed in an invented setting. Hard world building, exemplified by Tolkien, is when the history and geography and sociology and economics and whatever else of a setting are fleshed out in detail to create a sense of realism. But soft world building, which Hickson particularly associates with the filmmaker Hayao Miyazaki, is more subtle. It focuses instead on creating a distinctive atmosphere, while most of the specific details about how the setting works are left to your imagination. If hard world building is based on logic, soft world building is more emotional. It's about making you feel as if you've been transported into another world, and that is where Dunsany really shines. In his stories, he brings up all sorts of exotic gods, strange cities, and terrible monsters that are rarely explored in depth, but are described in a way that sparks your imagination and makes it feel as if you've entered a vast new world. The simple fact is, when I read George MacDonald, it feels like I'm reading an old fairy tale. When I read William Morris, it feels like I'm reading a medieval romance. But when I read Lord Dunsany, it feels like I'm reading fantasy. He obviously takes a bit of influence from classical mythology, a bit from European folklore, a bit from Arabian Nights, but he mixes them together into something that feels new, something of his own invention, in a way that I haven't seen in any previous writer. And all of this seems to have come to him naturally, whereas Tolkien was a perfectionist who was constantly reworking his old drafts. Dunsany wrote most of his stories on a whim, and he claimed that he rarely even bothered with proofreading. Instead, he spent most of his time on other hobbies like hunting, chess, and politics. There's quite a bit that can be said about his involvement in all of these, especially the latter one, but suffice to say that Dunsany was as much of a Tory as you'd expect of someone of his social class. His worldview isn't as apparent in his fiction, in the same way that Tolkien's Catholic morality or distaste for industrialization is in his legendarium, and if anything, Dunsany probably saw writing as an escape from his rather active involvement in politics. He stood unsuccessfully as a Conservative candidate for Parliament in 1906, and he was extremely active in trying to ensure that his homeland of Ireland remained part of the British Empire. He smuggled guns to distribute among Unionist paramilitaries, and when the Easter Rising broke out in 1916, Dunsany rushed from his castle towards Dublin to help the British Army put it down. He was immediately shot in the face, but he survived, and so he went on to write his most well-known work, the 1924 novel The King of Elfland's Daughter. Here, Dunsany puts aside his pseudo-Orientalist fixation, and he takes us to a setting more like William Morris would have written about, the land of Earl, which, we are told, is located somewhere in England around the year 1530. But as per usual, he pays so little heed to historical accuracy that we might as well be transported to another world entirely when we read the opening lines. In their ruddy jackets of leather that reached to their knees, the men of Earl appeared before their lord, the stately white-haired man in his long red room. He leaned in his carven chair and heard their spokesman. And thus their spokesman said, "For 700 years the chiefs of your race have ruled us well, and their deeds are remembered by the minor minstrels living on yet in their little tinkling songs. And yet the generations stream away, and there is no new thing. What would you?" said the Lord. "We would be ruled by a magic lord," they said. To fulfill this request, the Lord of Earl sends off his son Alveric to marry the King of Elfland's daughter, so that they may produce a hybrid child to eventually rule over the land. Now, when you think about elves, you're doubtlessly thinking of Tolkien, who, at the time this was published, was already developing that lore in his private writings that would later become the Silmarillion. But of course, the basic idea came long before Tolkien or Dunsany. The word elf originates in Germanic folklore, where it applied to a wide range of spirits and magical beings. In Renaissance England, the word became synonymous with the French-derived term fae or fairy. Sometimes these were depicted as tiny, mischievous creatures, and sometimes as fair and noble beings who look similar to humans. But in nearly all traditional depictions, they are more akin to angels and demons than they are to you or I. They don't inhabit the same material world as us, but live in a more spiritual plane of existence, varyingly called fairy or elfland. Tolkien maintains a version of this in his legendarium. The elves of Middle-earth are higher beings than mortal men, and their ultimate home is in the undying lands of Valinor. But later fantasy authors have downplayed this, leading to a popular vision of elves that are essentially just a type of person. They're often wiser and longer lived than humans, but at the end of the day, they are material beings who are made of the same flesh and bone. But this is far less the case with Dunsany. He makes use of tall, fair elves, much like Tolkien, but he also puts special emphasis on their otherworldly nature. Alveric must travel into an enchanted wood with a magic sword in hand in order to reach Elfland. Therein, he happens upon the King of Elfland's daughter, Lyrazel. Luckily for him, she's bored with this sheltered life and eager to join him in his return to Earl, so the two rush out before her father can cast a spell to stop them. And Alveric finds that in his brief foray into Elfland, a decade has passed in the human world. His father is dead, he is the new lord, and so Lyrazel becomes his consort, and they produce an heir named Orion. In a typical Dunsany short story, this might be where you get a happily ever after. But instead, the story keeps going. To conform to the customs of Earl, Lyrazel is forced to abandon the heathen ways of Elfland and adopt Christianity. And it might be worth noting here that despite his conservative worldview, Dunsany was an atheist, and in his works you can definitely see a low opinion of organized religion. Lyrazel finds no joy in this new life under constant judgment and scrutiny, and so she allows herself to be whisked back into Elfland by her father's magic. Alveric embarks on a quest to reclaim her, but finding that the previous path to Elfland is now closed off, he wanders fruitlessly for many years. Meanwhile, Orion grows to adulthood, where he disappoints those who had hoped that a magic lord would bring Earl to glory, and instead spends his time cavorting with trolls and going on hunts for unicorns. There's lots of little things going on besides this, but it's hard to give a concise summary. As we've acknowledged, Dunsany doesn't care much for developing the lore of his settings, but he's also not very focused on other matters like a structured plotline or dynamic characters. With him, it's once again all about the prose and atmosphere. The fantastical imagery is supposed to carry you away and make you willing to follow the story wherever it goes, which is often in all sorts of tangents that may seem superfluous to the main story. All of this can be a bit of an acquired taste when you're reading Dunsany's short stories, and when it comes to a full novel-length work, it's really sink or swim. You'll either really love it, or you'll find it to be really tedious. Probably the biggest recurring theme in the novel is the contrast between the mundane, small-minded land of Earl, which is subject to all the ravages of time and decay, and the magical, static world of Elfland. And here, another notable difference between Tolkien and Dunsany is that with the former, it's generally pretty clear who's the good guy and who's the bad guy and what principles they represent. While in The King of Elfland's Daughter, things are left much more to the reader's interpretation. Different people tend to have very different ideas about the meaning of the story and the degree to which the ultimate conclusion is a happy ending. For you see, within the short amount of time that has passed within Elfland, Lyrazel is overcome with grief over the family she has left behind in Earl. So, the King of Elfland casts a mighty spell which envelops all of Earl within the borders of his static, timeless realm. And with the last of his world-disturbing runes sent forth, and his daughter happy once more, the Elfin King on his tremendous throne breathed and drew in the calm in which Elfland basks. And all his realms dreamed on in that ageless repose, of which deep green pools in summer can barely guess. And Earl dreamed too with all the rest of Elfland, and so passed out of all remembrance of men. The King of Elfland's Daughter is widely considered to be Dunsany's magnum opus. It is also his last major work of fantasy. He continued to write prolifically for the rest of his life, but his later stories were far more grounded in our own world. Notably, he wrote a series of books set in Ireland, mostly out of spite when his rival W.B. Yeats barred him from the Irish Academy of Letters on the grounds that none of his stories up to that point actually took place on the island. And then, one of Dunsany's final novels, The Last Revolution, is a science fiction story about a robot uprising. But at that point, he had already contributed more than his fair share to the genre, and earned his position as perhaps the most high-profile writer of fantasy in the first half of the 20th century. But I say perhaps because there's one person who could challenge him for that title: James Branch Cabell. He was an American author, and in fact, it seems he was the only author of literary fantasy that the United States produced in this era. Just as Dunsany was descended from Norman aristocracy, Cabell was the scion of Virginia plantation families that had held a prominent place in state society since the 18th century. But from a young age, it seemed that he had a particular inclination towards scandal. He was nearly expelled from the College of William and Mary over allegations that he participated in a homosexual orgy. Then, after graduation, he found himself under suspicion in a high society murder case. But he was never prosecuted, and he managed to make a career as a prolific writer whose specialty was comedic stories set in a fictionalized version of medieval Europe. The novel that really broke him into fame was Jurgen, published in 1919. The book starts out in the fictional French county of Poitou, where the eponymous character is an aging pawnbroker who is magically regifted his youth and then goes on a gallivanting adventure that takes him to various locations. Some of them from reality, some of them from folklore mythology, and some of them entirely from Cabell's own imagination. It's a picaresque story where Jurgen opportunistically makes the most of whatever situation he finds himself in. Throughout the book, he describes himself as a monstrous clever fellow, and his main goal seems to be to seduce all of the women that he meets along the way. This is a list that ends up including Queen Guinevere, Helen of Troy, the goddess Anaitis, and the wife of the devil himself. But eventually, Jurgen ends up in a tense meeting with the creator of the universe, who restores him back to his old life, hopefully having learned a valuable lesson. None of Cabell's books up to this point had gotten that much attention, and at first, there was no indication that Jurgen would be much different. That is, until it received a legal challenge from the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, who objected to its lewd content. There are no explicit sex scenes in the book, but it is filled with euphemisms that more than toe the line. Jurgen lifted Anaitis from the altar, and they went into the chancel and searched for the adytum. There seemed to be no doors anywhere in the chancel, but presently Jurgen found an opening screened by a pink veil. Jurgen thrust with his lance and broke this veil. He heard the sound of one brief wailing cry. It was followed by soft laughter. So Jurgen came into the adytum. This led to a protracted legal battle, where Cabell ultimately came out on top, and in the meantime, the publicity from the case made him into one of the most celebrated literary figures in the entire country, with admirers ranging from H.L. Mencken to F. Scott Fitzgerald to the occultist Aleister Crowley, who appreciate a reference to one of his own sex magic rituals that made its way into the book. Cabell became known for his extensive body of work in this medieval fantastical setting. I've even seen the case that over the course of these many novels, Cabell becomes a masterful world builder on the same caliber as Tolkien, who builds a groundbreaking fictional cosmology with all of the various magical realms and powerful beings that appear in his stories. But having sampled Cabell's work, I don't really buy this. The primary purpose of these stories is satire. Plenty of fantastical concepts are brought up, but they're never explored in depth. The cosmology has no sense of coherence. Each individual element is brought up for a joke, and then quickly forgotten once it's served its purpose. This was an era where realistic storytelling was seen as the only respectable kind, and fantasy was fit only for children's bedtime stories. And so, Cabell's ironic, detached tone is exactly what made his work palatable to literary critics. They felt that fantasy was inherently ridiculous, and that's exactly how Cabell treated it. The critics could allow some grudging respect for Lord Dunsany as a man who used beautiful prose to tell stories about what was otherwise a bunch of nonsense phantasmagoria. But Cabell, they could truly admire as a man who took on those old, tired, medieval cliches with an intelligent, ironic edge. And I will warn anyone who feels tempted to read Jurgen for the bawdy humor and witty dialogue that, while there is some of that, the majority of the comedy is far more subtle. Large sections of the novel are just descriptions of the great beauty of the women that Jurgen meets, or dialogue where he waxes sentimentally about the nature of love. All of this is, of course, meant to be interpreted ironically, but it's so repetitive and it takes up so much of the book that the end result is, in the words of J.R.R. Tolkien when he was pressed for his opinion on Cabell, quite boring. I debated whether Cabell's work fell under the scope of this video, but I decided that it was at least worth a mention to show the state of the genre before Tolkien came along. To the extent that the average person saw fantasy for adults as a viable form of literature, their mind went either to the highly stylized pseudo-oriental tales of Lord Dunsany, or to the medieval sex comedies of James Branch Cabell. But often, the most interesting work is done by people who were less appreciated in their own lifetime, and that's especially true for this era of fantasy. Though, when it comes to genre classification, our next two stories lie at a bit of a crossroads. You see, just as the roots of fantasy were being laid by writers like George MacDonald and William Morris in the 1800s, so too was the genre of science fiction emerging, popularized by Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and a plethora of more obscure writers. Much like fantasy, science fiction tells stories about events beyond everyday experience, but other than that, we tend to see them as two very distinct categories. Whereas fantasy is based around magic, sci-fi is rooted in scientific materialism. Whereas fantasy harkens back to a romanticized past, sci-fi looks forward towards the future. Whereas fantasy has knights, swords, and dragons, sci-fi has aliens, ray guns, and spaceships. But there's nothing necessarily inherent about this distinction, and there's always been works of fiction that mix and match elements from each category. On that note, William Hope Hodgson was an Englishman who switched careers a few times throughout his life. First, he was a sailor, then a physical culture instructor, then he found his calling as a fiction writer, best known for mixing the traditional ghost story with quasi-scientific ideas of psychic energies. But for our purposes, one of his books stands above the others and takes us beyond the world we know, The Nightland, published in 1912. The book is presented as the written account of an unnamed 17th century gentleman who is deep in depression after the death of his wife Myrdath. But, in his dreams, he is transported to another time, millions upon millions of years into the future. At this point, just as Lord Kelvin had predicted, the sun has run out of energy and gone dim. The Earth is plunged into darkness, and all of humanity now lives in the Last Redoubt, a metallic pyramid nearly 13 kilometers high. Here, the last millions of humanity are holed up out of fear for what lurks beyond in the Nightland. What neither Lord Kelvin nor any other scientist could have predicted is that with the death of the sun, darker powers have re-emerged to terrorize mankind. Giants, abhumans, and monsters too terrible to describe haunt the world outside the Last Redoubt. The pyramid is protected by the air clog, an artificial energy barrier powered by the Earth current. But it is commonly accepted that one day soon the Earth current will fail, and then there will be nothing to stop the monsters from annihilating the last of humanity. The narrator has found himself in the body of one of his future incarnations, who is training to become a Monstruokan, a class of scholars who study the monsters so they can devise new ways to protect humanity. And their subjects of study are manifold, from the mysterious doorways in the night, of which no one knows what lies on the other end, to the House of Silence in the north, which is home to some great power that blocks any attempt to read its signatures, to the Watchers, beings the size of mountains who leer over the Nightland. To all appearances, they are an immobile part of the landscape, but observations over the millennia show that their position has changed over time, and they are slowly but surely coming closer. Among the Monstruokans, our narrator is of special renown due to his ability of night hearing. This is a sixth sense which lets him pick up on psychic energies. He spends much of his time scanning the Nightland for any signs of humanity because he is convinced that somewhere in the world must be the reincarnation of his Myrdath. He cannot find her psychic signature anywhere in the Last Redoubt, which means that somewhere out there must be another human settlement. At last, he finds it. Through their shared night hearing, he communicates with another human named Nani, who he knows to be a reincarnation of Myrdath. She lives in a distant settlement lost to history, known as the Lesser Redoubt. So he ventures forth to reach her, supplied only with some nutritional tablets, a suit of armor, a weapon known as a discus, essentially a kind of psychic buzzsaw, and a poison capsule which he is to take should he ever fall into the hands of monsters. For, as terrible as is the death of the body, it is a mercy compared to the destruction of the soul that will be inflicted if one is captured alive by the creatures of the Nightland. And as our unnamed hero leaves the Last Redoubt to embark on the road where the Silent Ones walk, we come to an unavoidable fact. This book is a massive slog. The Nightland is nearly 200,000 words long, which makes it longer than any of the individual volumes in The Lord of the Rings. And the majority of it is just a running log of how many hours the narrator walked during his journey, how many food capsules he ate, and how many hours he slept, repeated again and again, chapter after chapter, in these horrid run-on sentences, written in a rough approximation of how Hodgson imagined a 17th century gentleman would write. I never thought that I would miss William Morris's prose, but believe me, Hodgson is worse by several orders of magnitude. Now, to be fair, the monotony is broken up by other details. Sometimes he'll describe the strange sights of the Nightland. Sometimes he'll reminisce about how much he loves Myrdath/Nani. And sometimes, very occasionally, he'll get into a fight with a monster and dispatch it with his discus. But primarily, The Nightland is a dry travelogue where the narrator feels the need to repeat every little thing in tedious detail. A lot of the time, when you're having trouble reading an old classic, you'll think to yourself, is this a work of genius that I'm too stupid to understand, or is it just badly written? The Nightland is the only case that I've ever seen where the consensus among critics is that it's just badly written. But at last, our protagonist makes it to the Lesser Redoubt, only to find that it has gone dark. Its barrier has failed, and the pyramid has been overrun by monsters. Yet it turns out that the sole survivor of this attack was Nani, and so the two lovers are together again. You might think that this would be the heartfelt conclusion, but instead it's only the novel's halfway point. The journey back is just as long, is described in just as much tedious detail, and this is compounded by the fact that we now have to read Hodgson's handling of romance, which I can only describe as nauseating. The relationship is, on one hand, very loving. The constant, deadly peril of the Nightland does not deter their displays of affection. It's very rare for more than 2 paragraphs to pass without them kissing each other. And then, just about every time they stop to rest, we are also treated to a description of him lovingly rubbing and kissing her feet. But there is also a clear power dynamic to this relationship. In the narrator's own words, he is her master, and she is his baby slave. And this is all the more disturbing, given that, well, I think she's supposed to be an adult, but she seems to have the mental capacities of a child. Half the time, she is slavishly loyal to her master, and seeks to serve him in whatever way she can. And then, the other half, she rebels with immature acts of mischief that endanger both of their lives. The protagonist responds to her naughtiness, as he calls it, with physical punishment. This would be horrifying, if not for the fact that she seems to be strangely into it.
I set the belt thrice more across her shoulder, very sharp, so that she'd to learn wisdom at once, and I be free forever of this need to pain her, which did hurt me very strange. And the maid to stand very quiet, now that I did keep her from coming on to me, and her head did be something bent, so that I knew not whether I mayhap have flogged her over hard. For I did be something lacking in the knowledge whether that a maid be easily hurt. I stooped and looked into her face, and lo, she did be smiling naughtily, and kissed me in a moment very saucy on the mouth, ere I did be aware, and afterwards she laughed, and made to try and make a bitter mock upon me.
The two of them journey long and hard, but as they get closer, they are assailed by monsters. Though they are rescued by warriors from the Last Redoubt in the nick of time, it is too late to heal Nani from the mortal wounds she has sustained. As you might expect, her controlling, codependent lover is thrown into turmoil by this development. But as a funeral is held, the mysterious power of the Earth Current intervenes, and she is returned from the dead. It seems that just as the cosmic forces of evil assail the last of humanity, there are also cosmic forces of good that will aid them in whatever ways they can. And so, though the Earth may still be dying, though humanity is still under constant threat from monsters, the two lovers live out the rest of their lives in the Last Redoubt in bliss. And the narrator of the story, the 17th century gentleman who is dreaming all this, is content. For he knows that though Myrdaf may be lost to him in this life, they will, one day, be reunited. The Nightland has a well-earned reputation as a frustrating book. But the imagery of a dying Earth assailed by cosmic horrors has nonetheless stuck with many readers through the years. You can find very little precedent in anything that came before it. Maybe Hodgson was inspired by John Milton's depiction of hell in Paradise Lost. Maybe H.G. Wells's dystopian future in The Time Machine. but I could find no definitive answers about the basis for the Nightland, or exactly what type of message Hodgson was trying to send with it. He might have fleshed out this mythos further if it were not for the outbreak of World War I. Hodgson, then in his late 30s, volunteered for service, and then, despite being wounded multiple times, he insisted that he be returned to the front, until he was killed by artillery fire in Belgium in 1918. And so he has left behind a deeply weird body of work that has maintained a cult following over the years. I can't find any evidence that Tolkien ever read The Nightland, but we do have what I think is a harsh but fair assessment from his good friend C.S. Lewis. W.H. Hodgson's The Nightland would have made it an eminence from the unforgettable somber splendor of the images it presents, if it were not disfigured by a sentimental and irrelevant erotic interest, and by a foolish and flat archaicism of style. And while we're on the subject of strange, genre-bending books, of all the authors covered in this video, David Lindsay is the one where biographic information seems sparsest. But much like Hodgson, all of his books contain fantastical elements, and also like Hodgson, only one of them goes the step of taking us to an entirely different world. That is his 1920 debut, A Voyage to Arcturus. This book follows a British man named Maskell, who is cajoled by two shady characters named Crag and Nightspore into taking a ride in their spaceship, heading towards the planet Tormance around the star system Arcturus. As they take off, Maskell blacks out, only to wake up on the planet alone, with no memory of landing or any idea of where his companions have gone off to. And here, the book gives up on any pretense of explaining the events of the story scientifically. Maskell finds that his body is changed. Most notably, he now has a new appendage, a type of tentacle called a mane, growing out of his chest. Confused, he journeys across Tormance and runs into a wide range of colorful characters. They teach him how to make use of the supernatural abilities that he possesses with this new body, and they also tell him about the cosmology of this world. All of their stories wildly contradict each other, but they generally agree that there is a creator god of Tormance who is known by varying names, including Sutor, Shaping, and Crystal Man, and he is opposed by a satanic figure known as Crag, the very same who brought Maskell here in the first place. And so, Maskell is swept up on a series of surreal, episodic adventures, seeing strange sights, meeting strange people, and hearing their philosophical viewpoints, in which there's a very noticeable emphasis on male-female dualism. This reaches its most memorable point with the character of Liholfe, who is a Fane, a species whose members are perfect in every way, and this necessarily means that they are equal parts male and female. As such, Liholfe is referred to with an invented set of a-er pronouns. All of these events proceed somewhat randomly, and the story doesn't really follow a clear internal logic. And for that reason, the book is usually interpreted as a philosophical work that's meant to be interpreted symbolically. In that way, it's comparable to fantasies, which we covered earlier, and this shouldn't be too surprising, given that one of the few facts I could find about Lindsay is that he was a big fan of George MacDonald. But if nothing else, I do think that A Voyage for Arcturus stands out in the history of fantasy for its psychedelic imagery, for throwing out previously established tropes and conventions, and testing the limits of what type of story an author can tell when they're not bound by the laws of reality. A Voyage for Arcturus is the type of story that a lot of people read and say, huh, that was really weird. But for a subset of readers, its symbolism hits them in a way that's life-changing. Tolkien quite enjoyed it, but his passion doesn't begin to compare with that of C.S. Lewis, who felt so inspired that he wrote his own space trilogy, which takes a similar concept but adds an explicitly Christian spin on it. The books follow an academic philologist named Arthur Ransom, who shares quite a few similarities with a certain friend of Lewis's, as he travels across the solar system, discovering that every planet is a paradise ruled by benevolent angelic archons, with the exception of Earth, the silent planet, whose archon Lucifer wages war against the rest of the universe. But that's a whole other can of worms. Speaking of which, Eric Rooker Edison was a civil servant in the British Board of Trade, who in 1922 released an epic fantasy novel titled The Worm Ouroboros. This was a long time in the making. The basic concept came when he was only 10 years old and invented stories of characters like Lord Juss, Goldry Bluesco, and Brandok Daha, and the antics they got up to together. Many people come up with fantastic narratives like this as children, and then grow out of them. But Edison never did. He went to Eton, he graduated from Oxford, he joined the civil service, but the adventures of Lord Juss and Brandok Daha were always at the back of his mind, and in 1922, when he was nearly 40 years old, it had become a full novel. The book starts on Earth with an Englishman named Lessingham, who is visited at night by a martlet, a type of mythical bird, that transports him to the planet Mercury. Now, you might be expecting another science fiction-infused story, but in sharp contrast to Lindsay's Tormance, Mercury, as Edison presents it, does not feel at all like an alien world. In fact, it's remarkably similar to the English Lake District that Lessingham had just departed. As soon as he gets there, he even finds himself in a grove of Irish yews. But Mercury is also a more magical world than Earth, and it's inhabited by mythical races, demons, witches, goblins, imps, and pixies. The martlet takes Lessingham to the great castle of Galing in Demonland, which is ruled by the Lord Juss, who is celebrating his birthday along with his brothers Goldry Bluesco and Spitfire, and their cousin Brandok Daha. These demons are described as looking very much like humans, with the addition of horns at the top of their heads. Lessingham in this world is like a ghost. He cannot interact with his surroundings in any way, so he simply watches while Lord Juss's birthday celebration is interrupted.
Lord, it is an ambassador from Witchland and his train. Their ship made land at Lookinghaven Ness at nightfall. They slept on board, and your soldiers gave them escort to Galing at break of day. He craveth present audience.
As you can see, Edison is yet another fantasy writer who feels that if you're going to write a story that evokes an older, more romantic age, then it's only fitting that you should write it in an archaic style. In this book, he writes in Jacobean prose, the type that would fit in during the 1600s. And so, the ambassador reads the following message from King Gerais XI of Witchland.
I hereby summon and command you, Juss, Spitfire, and Goldry Bluesco, to make haste and come to me in Witchland, in my fortress of Carsey, and there dutifully kiss my toe, in witness before all the world that I am your lord and king, and rightful overlord of all of Demonland.
This demand does not go over well, but Goldry Bluesco comes up with a way to settle the dispute. Is not Geraint a mighty wrestler? And hath he not in his palace in Carsey the skulls and bones of 99 great champions, whom he hath vanquished and slain in that exercise? Puffed up beyond measure is he in his own conceit, and folk say that it is a grief to him that none have been found in this long while that durst wrestle with him, and woefully he pineth for the 100th. He shall wrestle a fall with me. With this, the Martlet takes Lessingham a few weeks into the future to the Foliot Isles, where the fate of Demonland is being decided by a wrestling match, or to use the language of the book, a wrestling match. This is also the last time that Lessingham ever appears in the story. As the events go on, he's presumably still there watching, but if so, we don't hear anything about it. Edison apparently felt that this framing device was important to set up the story, but it was too awkward to actually keep up with it. And so, in the wrestling match, which I should mention is conducted in the nude, Geraint tries to cheat, and this enrages Goldry Bluesco, who picks the king up and dashes his head against the ground, killing him instantly. The demons have won, fair and square, but the witches won't give up so easily. They rush back to their capital of Carsey, where the new king Geraint XII rules. Except it's soon made clear that this is the exact same Geraint. All 12 monarchs of this line have been the very same soul who, by black magic, takes a new body each time he is slain. He is eternal, much like the worm Ouroboros, which he wears as his signet ring. All of this is revealed to Geraint's favorite minion, a goblin named Lord Grow, as he is brought in to help with a ritual to summon a dark spirit against the demon's fleet as it returns home, so that a storm descends upon them, and when it is past, Goldry Bluesco has been spirited away to some prison of Geraint's. This is the first blow in a great war between Witchland and Demonland, which is then chronicled throughout the rest of the book. It's a convoluted tale involving hand-to-hand combat with manticores, one-night stands with sorceresses, hippogriff shenanigans, Lord Grow switching sides multiple times, and overall, a story that has many similarities with the type of high fantasy that we associate with Tolkien, but in many other ways is very different. For one, the setting feels less medieval and more like the Renaissance era. The Jacobean prose is one factor in this. There's also the way that magic is described, which strongly evokes Renaissance alchemy and esotericism. And then there's the multiple references to tennis and marmalade throughout the book, neither of which were really popular until after the end of the Middle Ages. But in other ways, the world of the worm Ouroboros belongs to a more distant mythic past, where acts of great heroism and terrible magic are commonplace, where the affairs of nations depend on the deeds of heroic individuals rather than broader institutions, and even where, as seems to be the case throughout the story, all animals are sapient and have the ability to speak. The setting is basically a smorgasbord of European history and mythology. In fact, whenever the characters themselves talk about religion, they always use the names of the Greek gods, Aphrodite, Apollo, Ares, and so on. Edison definitely took quite a bit from the Iliad and other ancient Greek sources, but he also took quite a bit from Shakespeare, and quite a bit from what's probably his greatest love, the Old Norse sagas. And this is where we get the most famous and most controversial aspect of the worm Ouroboros. As opposed to J.R.R. Tolkien, who tried to temper the epic heroism of the sagas with a sense of austere Christian morality, E.R. Edison shows far more sympathy towards the pagan mindset. His characters are proud warrior aristocrats. They are unabashedly rowdy, sarcastic, and violent. In any other story, this would be treated as a character flaw, but instead, Edison luxuriates in descriptions of their epic feats in battle, something that's only rivaled in his equal luxuriance for the material comforts that accompany their high status. The worm Ouroboros is downright decadent in its drawn-out descriptions of elaborate dress, architecture, and decor. We get an entire massive paragraph dedicated to Lord Just's bed, which is made from gold, inlaid with jewels, and carved with illustrations of all his greatest deeds of daring do. I have to say, E.R. Edison is up there with William Morris and William Hope Hodgson in terms of difficult prose, but his writing is so much more fun to read, if only because of how everything in the story is so flamboyantly over the top. As for the narrative's central conflict, the demons are presented as the good guys as opposed to the witches, but this is less because they're kind or altruistic, and more because they're honorable and prefer to solve their problems through straightforward violence rather than devious trickery. And here, I think Edison is just as guilty as Tolkien in transposing his own modern values onto this mythic setting. If you look at Greek or Norse mythology, there's absolutely no shortage of trickster heroes. But Edison seems obsessed with this more reductionist idea of honor and the glory of open combat, and as we reach the end of the story, we see this worldview taken to its logical conclusion. The demons learn from a magical woman named Sophonisba that Golgi Blusko is imprisoned atop a mountain called Zoraraknamsarion. This mountain cannot be climbed, but can only be reached by riding atop a hippogriff. And so, when Lord Just eventually obtains one, he flies to Zoraraknamsarion and witnesses illusions designed to distract him from his goal. This includes the most terrible thing that E.R. Edison can imagine. A thing that surpasses all other horrors in this land of high magic and terrible sorcery. The thing that would most demand intervention from a hero like Lord Just. This turns out to be a black man menacing a white woman. But with great difficulty, Just looks past this illusion and does not let it distract him from rescuing Golgi Blusko. Now that they are reunited, the demons' forces are unstoppable. They crush the witches' army in battle, and as they approach the capital of Carcy, the court of Witchland falls into disarray. The High Lords collapse into infighting, and King Garice attempts one final desperate act of black magic, which ends in his own destruction. Witchland and its royal line are utterly annihilated. The worm Ouroboros has been uncoiled. Or so it seems. The final chapter takes place a year later, when Sophonisba pays the demons a visit. Now that Witchland is defeated, they are, for all intents and purposes, masters of the entire world. And they have no idea what to do with themselves. They've tried to keep themselves entertained. Lord Just has even created a terrarium filled with homunculi. But at this pace, with their lifestyle of instant gratification that grants no sense of challenge, they'll soon degenerate into utter flaccidity. Their only other options are to spend their time waging low-stakes wars of imperialism against weaker countries, or else fall into civil conflict betwixt themselves. Neither of these options appeal to them very much. But Sophonisba says that she might try to evoke the gods in order to solve their problem, to turn back time and let them return to their days of glory. At first, it seems that nothing comes of their ritual, but then, the next day in their hole, they are interrupted. No sound there was in that high presence chamber in Gayling, till a minute's space the serving man returned with a startled countenance, and bowing before Lord Just, said, "Lord, it is an ambassador from Witchland in his train. He craveth present audience." The Worm Ouroboros is a strange and fascinating book. I don't think I can confidently use adjectives like good or enjoyable to read, but strange and fascinating go without question. Though not commercially successful, it had its share of fans. James Branch Cabell, of all people, really enjoyed it, and Edison himself ended up attending a few meetings of the Inklings, the informal literary society that included J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both of whom were very impressed. Tolkien described Edison as the greatest and most convincing writer of invented worlds that I have ever read, which, from him, is no small praise. By the standards of modern fantasy, Edison's world-building might feel a bit shoddy. Why do they worship Greek gods on Mercury? But at the time, no one else was telling fantasy stories which had such a large cast of characters and locations, while also keeping any sense of internal consistency. The Worm Ouroboros feels like a direct precursor to The Lord of the Rings, far more so than any other book we've gone over. Yet, Tolkien denied that it was a direct influence, and I see no reason to doubt this. The two are a similar type of book, an expansive story inspired by myth and legend about a war for the fate of a magical invented world. But when it comes to the specifics of the setting, plot, and characters, they diverge into wildly different directions. Tolkien had his criticisms of Edison's writing, the peculiarly bad nomenclature, and the shallow characterization, for instance. But far more than anything else, he was disturbed by the worldview it presents. The Worm Ouroboros is a full-throated celebration of eternal warfare and might makes right philosophy, which is a particularly bold stance considering that it was published just 4 years after the end of World War I. By all accounts, Edison was someone who genuinely believed that the purpose of life is struggle, that some people are inherently more fit in this competition, and it is the prerogative of these people to strive towards greatness without any concern for the objections of lesser men. He apparently dismissed Tolkien's values of peace and tranquility as soft. And here, I do think it is relevant to point out that Tolkien was a veteran of the war, while Edison spent the entire time occupied with his cushy office job at the Board of Trade. A lot of people have noted the overlap between Edison's philosophy and the rhetoric of fascist movements that were just beginning to proliferate in Europe around the time The Worm Ouroboros was published. But to his limited credit, Edison had no kind words to say for the likes of Mussolini and Hitler. He saw fascism as a collectivist ideology that smothered the individual drive towards heroism. To him, the ideal society was medieval Iceland, which was a remote backwater where central authority was weak, and therefore, in his view, it became an anarcho-capitalist paradise where there was nothing to stop the best men from striving to the top. Edison spent more and more of his time thinking over this philosophy until it formed the basis of a new fantasy series. You see, if we're comparing Edison to Tolkien, The Worm Ouroboros was just The Hobbit. His equivalent to The Lord of the Rings is the Zimiamvian trilogy. Edison devoted the final years of his life to these books, and the outbreak of the Second World War only strengthened his resolve. He believed that his writing was essential to the war effort, that his books would give the country the sense of purpose and meaning it needed to strike the final blow against the Nazis. And so, it might not surprise you to hear that Edison's opinion of his own writing was over-high. The worm Ouroboros is obscure today, but it's still a bit of a cult classic. It has a rather difficult, archaic style, but this, in many ways, adds to the charm when it's being used in such an action-packed book. It creates the feeling of something truly epic. But fans of Zimiamvia are far fewer and further between. It is written in a similarly dense style, but with a much more subdued plotline. The characters spend half of their time engaging in courtly politics, and the other half discussing abstract philosophy. And don't get me wrong, that's something that can definitely be interesting in the hands of the right author. But with Edison's handling, Zimiamvia is a painfully slow and confusing read. He himself said that one can only truly understand and appreciate it after reading and rereading it multiple times. That being said, Zimiamvia is mentioned in The Worm Ouroboros as the afterlife for true heroes, an equivalent of Valhalla or the Elysian Fields. But when it appears in the trilogy, it is presented as a fairly normal place where people are born, live out their lives, and die. Here we again find ourselves in a world highly reminiscent of Renaissance Europe, with all the accompanying references to tennis and marmalade. It is also a more mundane world than that of the worm Ouroboros. Magic still exists, but it's much more low-key, and the characters are all normal humans, with the exception of the two shape-shifting comic relief nymphs, Campaspe and Anthea. We also get a map of Zimiamvia, which in its general outline is a vague blobular shape with a westward-facing coastline, oddly convergent with Tolkien's Middle-earth. You see this type of map a lot in fantasy, and I've always assumed that they were just ripping off Tolkien, and to be fair, I imagine many of them are, but it also seems that there's something deeper there that predates The Lord of the Rings. Maybe it's something that writers gravitate towards as an ultra-simplified map of Europe. And as for the plotline of the books, well, it takes place across two worlds with the volumes published in reverse chronological order, and the final one released posthumously as an unfinished draft. But to give a brief summary, the main story concerns the three kingdoms of Fingisrold, Mesria, and Rarik, which King Mezentius unites into a single realm through a complicated web of war, intrigue, and consensual cuckoldry. His rule is long and prosperous, but when he and his only male heir are murdered in quick succession, chaos ensues. Meanwhile, a concurrent plotline takes place in 20th century England following Edward Lessingham, the very same guy from the framing device of The Worm Ouroboros. As it turns out, when he's not sojourning in Mercury, he is an agent for the British Foreign Office. His career is storied. He engaged in guerrilla fighting during the Rif War in the 1920s. He played a pivotal role in suppressing the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919, and at some point he led an invasion of Paraguay. Yet, we don't actually see him doing any of that. These details are just tangentially mentioned. Nearly all of his time on page is spent in domestic bliss with his wife Mary. That, and dishing out some seriously problematic political opinions. But when Mary dies, Lessingham is unable to process the grief in any healthy way, so naturally he launches a private invasion of the Norwegian archipelago of Lofoten. There he reigns for decades as a benevolent dictator before he dies of natural causes on the eve that the Norwegian army was finally getting around to evicting him. But Lessingham was a true hero, or at least he was according to E.R. Edison's moral framework, and the afterlife reserved for true heroes is Zimianvia. And so he is reborn, kind of. Within Zimianvia, there is a character named Lessingham, who was born there and has lived there his entire life, but who we are presumably meant to interpret as a reincarnation as Lessingham from Earth. The reborn Lessingham ends up canoodling with Mezentius's heir, Antiope, and this affair is one of a handful of relationships that receives special attention from the narrative. There's a similar focus on the relationship of the old King Mezentius with his mistress Amalia, and their bastard son Barganax with his mistress Fiorinda. As the story goes on, it's made clear to us that there's a cosmic importance to these characters. These are not just lovely women, they are incarnations of the goddess Aphrodite. These are not just great men, they are incarnations of the god Zeus. Aphrodite is meant to represent the concept of beauty, that which is valuable for its own sake. Her purpose, essentially, is to sit around and be perfect in every way. The entire moral framework of the universe revolves around her. Anything that pleases her is good, and anything that displeases her is evil. But she is an inherently passive figure, so it is the duty of Zeus, the personification of love, to act on her whims. He performs actions that please her, and he destroys anything which causes her distress. In the Worm Ouroboros, Edison expressed the view that the purpose of life is struggle. In Zimianvia, he elaborates that this struggle should specifically be directed in the service of beauty. Any crass villain can strive for his own venal interests, but a true hero makes the perpetuation of beauty his purpose in life. Or at least, that's the best summary I can give of Edison's intent. He gives a much longer explanation in the introduction of the second book, A Fish Dinner in Mnemosyne. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend you the doctoral thesis, Secondary Worlds in Pre-Tolkienian Fantasy Fiction by Joe Young, which includes a section on E.R. Edison, and was my main source in trying to make sense of all this. And it's during the eponymous Fish Dinner in Mnemosyne that the cosmic significance of this arrangement is fully shown. The family gets into a discussion of philosophy, with lots of references to the ideas of Baruch Spinoza. One thing leads to another, and Mezentius decides to create a world. This is apparently a rather straightforward piece of magic, and so, in their dinner room, a new world appears in front of them like a bubble. They watch as life emerges in this world. They watch as civilizations rise and fall, and at a certain point, they decide to enter it themselves. As it turns out, this world is Earth. Barganax and his father Mezentius merge into the figure of Lessingham, whereas Fiorinda and Amalia become Mary, and so they live out their lives on Earth until their natural ends, whereupon they are thrust back into Zimianvia with only a short amount of time having passed. and thus they have experienced Earth, a world that doesn't follow the heroic fantasy logic of Zimianvia, but instead its own natural laws. And Aphrodite, in the form of Fiorinda, shows what she thinks of this by taking out her hairpin and popping the bubble. It's only a short time afterwards that Mezentius is slain, but in this time also emerges his reincarnation in the form of Lessingham, and so he continues on in the only afterlife fit for a true hero, a cycle of constant struggle in service of beauty. In discussions of fantasy and science fiction, there's a certain pantheon of authors who are revered for combining elaborate world-building, epic plotlines, and a strong philosophical through-line into a grand, cohesive whole. J.R.R. Tolkien, Frank Herbert, and George R.R. Martin seem to be the most popular in online discussions. But E.R. Edison stands out as the example of this type of storytelling. The earliest writer I've ever encountered who used speculative fiction as a medium for such an ambitious project. Something that tries to be more than mere allegory and instead creates a world that stands up on its own terms, but at the same time is more than mere escapism and contains themes that are resonant with our own world. But Edison has also been nearly completely forgotten, and for understandable reasons. His books are obscure, his writing is a real slog, and compared to the others, his philosophy is convoluted and at times rather distasteful. But yet, I can't help but feel that these flaws just make him all the more compelling. There's just so much that can be said for good and for ill about the Worm Ouroboros and the Zimianvian trilogy. But in the interest of not derailing this entire video, I should probably move on. E.R. Edison is a tough act to follow, but if his books stand out for their epic scope, it's only fitting that we turn to something more down to earth. Helen Hope Mirrlees was part of the modernist literary scene in 1920s Britain. She hung out in the same circles as Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot, and wrote a few novels of her own, which were conventional realistic fiction, up until her final book, Blood in the Mist, in 1926. Here she takes a sudden fantastical turn, and it's been suggested that in this subject matter, she may have been inspired by her close friend, Jane Ellen Harrison, who was a scholar of religion and folklore. The two were longtime roommates, and within their social circle there was quite a bit of speculation about the exact nature of the relationship. The book takes place in the eponymous town of Blood in the Mist, which in turn is the capital of the Free State of Doromir, which in turn appears to be located in a world completely separate from our own. The book is told from the perspective of an omniscient narrator who occasionally makes references to our own Earth, but in the few instances where the characters themselves talk about the world outside of Doromir, it's always to other fictitious locations like the Cinnamon Isles or the Amber Desert. And so, this might well be the very first fantasy book that's set in a self-contained universe completely separate from our own. All the others thus far have been in Earth's own past or future, or in another planet or dimension that's connected to Earth in some way. Though I should emphasize that the setting of the story, the country of Dormir, is nothing exotic. It is highly reminiscent of rural England in some ambiguous period after the end of the Middle Ages, but before the onset of industrialization. You can think of it as if Tolkien had written an entire book set exclusively in the Shire. Our protagonist is Nathaniel Chanticleer, who holds the dual offices of Mayor of Ludden the Mist and High Seneschal of Dormir. This isn't a very arduous job, since the politics of Dormir are little more than an old boys' club of the merchant class, the bourgeoisie by the original definition of the term. But his life becomes a lot more difficult when the town is afflicted by a sudden influx of fairy fruit. You see, Dormir lies just across the border to Fairyland, and fairy fruit seems to function as a narcotic. It causes delirium in those that eat it, and it is highly addictive. The epidemic rocks Chanticleer's administration, threatening his position as mayor and turning the story into something of a detective novel as he tries to get to the bottom of the smuggling operation. In the way that it focuses on the contrast between a familiar English-style village and the mysterious realm of fairy, there's quite a few comparisons that can be made between Ludden the Mist and Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter, which was published only 2 years previously, though I can't find any direct evidence that Mirrlees was aware of Dunsany's work. And similarly, the two of them also wrap up with a somewhat unconventional ending, where you could have quite a bit of debate over exactly what we should make of it. You see, we get a surprising amount of world building regarding Dormir's history. In the past, it was a monarchy that harbored close relations with Fairyland, and where a reverence for all things fae took the form of an organized religion, and fairy fruit was the drug of choice for the decadent ruling class. But under the capricious Duke Aubrey, the merchant class rose up in rebellion and expelled the aristocracy and clergy from the country. They transformed Dormir into a modern, respectable country where the rational rule of law is supreme and all things fairy are shunned. But this new order isn't as settled as they had hoped, and the fairy fruit crisis stirs up old resentment. Among the common people, there is a nostalgia for the days of Duke Aubrey, which the narrator explicitly compares to the Jacobite movement in 18th century Britain. And there is a belief that through all these years, he has been hiding in Fairyland, biding his time to return. The smugglers rile up these passions and bring the country towards the verge of civil war. As Dormir falls apart, Chanticleer journeys directly into Fairyland, where he meets with Duke Aubrey himself. We are not told exactly what transpires during this meeting, but when Chanticleer returns to Ludden the Mist, he has negotiated a new path for Dormir, a compromise between the Modern Order and the Ancien regime. Part of this compromise is that fairy fruit shall be freely distributed into Dormir. We are told, somewhat ambiguously, that the problem up to this point has not been too much fairy fruit, but too little. And so prosperity comes again to Dormir, and fairy fruit becomes so plentiful that an entire industry is created from candying it and exporting it abroad. Ludden the Mist is a rather unique book, but it never really caught on. It was so obscure in its own time that it's the only book in this video where I can't find any record of either Tolkien or C.S. Lewis ever having read it. It also marked the conclusion of Mirrlees's literary career. Only a couple of years after it was published, Mirrlees converted to Catholicism and gave up writing entirely. And here, much like with Dunsany and Edison, things take a bit of a turn. Mirrlees didn't need to work for a living, as she inherited a large share of wealth from her father, who was the co-founder of the Tongaat Sugar Company in South Africa. Its plantations had earned a reputation as some of the most horrifically cruel in the entire Dominion, but this doesn't seem to have bothered Mirrlees. She even moved to South Africa herself and lived there from 1948 to 1963. That was a very eventful time in that country's history, though she lived in such obscurity that I can't find any documentation on whether she had any opinions one way or the other. But though she abandoned the literary world, Lud in the Mist stands out as her most memorable work. A fantasy book that eschews any focus on epic quests or major battles, and where the political intrigue is at a far more local level, and far more of the book is focused on low-stakes conflicts in the lives of ordinary people, something that, even today, makes it stand out compared to the rest of the genre. Lud in the Mist is also the final work of literary fantasy that I think unambiguously falls into the scope that we defined at the beginning of this video of secondary world fantasy written for adults. But of course, there's also plenty more edge cases that I could discuss. Along with A Voyage to Arcturus, there were other interplanetary stories that incorporated elements of the supernatural. There were mythological retellings like Evangeline Walton's The Island of the Mighty, originally published as The Virgin and the Swine, based on an episode of the Welsh Mabinogion. Or T.H. White's retellings of Arthurian myth that would later be collected into a single volume as The Once and Future King, which take extensive liberties with their source material to tell a character-based story with heavy allusions to 1930s geopolitics. There's also Austin Tappan Wright's Islandia, which takes place in a fictional country with highly detailed, hard world building, on par with Tolkien, though it's set on our own Earth and has no elements of magic within it. So I'd say it's better classified as alternate history rather than fantasy. And of course, there's the Chronicles of Narnia, which C.S. Lewis wrote once he was done with the Space Trilogy. And I should also mention that everything we've gone over so far are books that were originally published in English. In my research, I didn't come across any examples of secondary world fantasy for adults that was written in any other language, though it seems likely that some must exist out there somewhere. I find it hard to believe, if nothing else, there wasn't at least one German or French guy who got the same idea as Tolkien, Edison, and Dunsany. So if you know of any, please let me know in the comments below. But this video is already getting long enough, so I'll go over just one more example of literary fantasy, one that comes up so often when people talk about the genre before Tolkien that I feel like if I ignored it, I'd be doing you a disservice. Mervyn Peake was a British artist and illustrator. Over the course of his career, he wrote some poetry and some children's books, but nothing could have anticipated his magnum opus published following the Second World War, the Gormenghast trilogy. These books are relatively obscure, but they're probably more well known than anything we've gone over up to this point, with an enduring reputation as an overlooked classic of secondary world fantasy, a worthy rival to The Lord of the Rings. Which is a weird position to be in, given that it's debatable whether the series really counts as fantasy, or if it really takes place in a secondary world. After all, the supernatural doesn't really play any role in the story. There's plenty of stuff that's strange and unlikely, but nothing that explicitly involves magic. And as for the world where it takes place, well, most of the book's initial readers in the 1940s and 1950s probably would have assumed that the setting of the story, the Castle Gormenghast, is supposed to be located somewhere in the United Kingdom. The characters generally have English-sounding names, along with the stuffy manners you'd expect of the British upper class. But throughout the first two books, we hear very little of the world outside. There are offhanded allusions to Christianity in the series, which do suggest that it takes place on our own Earth. But the Castle Gormenghast doesn't really fit anywhere on a map. The biggest clue to its geographic location is probably the offhand mention of flying squirrels and possums among the fauna outside the castle. This is not a combination of creatures you'd expect to see in the Eastern Hemisphere, but yet, if this giant ancient castle exists in the New World, then that raises so many more questions. The setting of the book is often described as medieval, but this isn't really right. If you pay attention, the characters regularly talk about laudanum, barbecue, cardboard, microbes, and women's periodicals. Gormenghast is clearly situated in a relatively modern world, though very little of modernity has found its way inside the castle. It is a stagnant place, bound by tradition. And that feeling of stagnation is what matters most of all, more than any of the concrete details of the setting. Much like Dunsany, Peake is a master of soft world building. The actual history and geography of Gormenghast matters far less than how it reflects the mood of the story, how it sets the stage for the real focus, the emotional struggles and interpersonal conflicts of the characters who inhabit it. And these are strange beings unto themselves. They come off less as realistic humans and more as exaggerated caricatures, defined by their eccentricities and insecurities. About half of them are fanatically dedicated to defending the castle's social order at all cost, while the other half are deeply dissatisfied with their position, yet too stuck in their maladaptive patterns to do anything about it. Our nominal protagonist is Titus Groan, the 77th Earl of Gormenghast, who has the misfortune of growing up, essentially, as the only neurotypical person in the entire castle. He's also a rather passive character. In fact, he spends the entirety of the first book as an infant. So most of our time is spent in the lives of the eccentric side characters. And of all of them, the main driver of action is Steerpike, a kitchen boy who embarks on a campaign of murder and deception to set himself up as the master of Gormenghast. Or, at least, that's the focus of the first two books. The third in the trilogy, Titus Alone, follows our protagonist as he flees from Gormenghast and discovers that the outside world is much like the castle itself, an uncanny place that doesn't quite resemble any specific location on our own Earth. It is populated by its own cast of eccentric characters. The story also takes a bit of a sci-fi turn, with a plotline centered around a cabal of evil scientists with a death ray. You might expect that this would be rather exciting, but in practice, the story ends up being slow, confusing, and rather depressing. And to be fair, the first two books were also slow, confusing, and rather depressing, but they had a certain charm and sense of coherence that Titus Alone just doesn't live up to. It doesn't help that Mervyn Peake began showing symptoms of dementia around the time he was finishing this book, and it's quite likely he would have put it through several more rounds of revision if he had been able. This also cut short his plans to extend Titus's story into a longer series. The result is an unconventional series that doesn't neatly fit into any genre classification, but over the years it's been decided that fantasy is the most apt label. There might be nothing happening that's explicitly magical, but Gormenghast has such a sense of unreality about it that it certainly feels fantastic. And whenever there's a discussion of Gormenghast, people will invariably compare it to Tolkien, usually with the argument that Peake, in some way, did it better. But honestly, I cannot bring myself to have a stance on this argument. Of all the books we've gone over, the Gormenghast series is probably the one that's least comparable to The Lord of the Rings. It has a very different atmosphere, it follows a very different structure, it has very different goals as a story. It's a bit like arguing whether Wuthering Heights is superior to Beowulf. Any argument you make will ultimately say more about your own personal taste than it will about either book's actual merit. No reasonable person would see a competition between the two. They are simply two different books that can both be appreciated on their own terms. We've gone over lots of books that each have their own spin on things, and while you can definitely compare and contrast them, after all, that's kind of the entire point of this video, at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong way to approach fantasy. The genre is big enough to contain everything we've gone over, plus a lot more, and we're all the better off for it. As we've seen, the origins of fantasy are quite diverse. The idea of taking old myths, legends, and fairy tales, and using them as inspiration to invent something new, had come to multiple authors independently of each other. We've seen that some of the tropes that we associate with Tolkien-esque fantasy were already well in the zeitgeist before he came around. Even before The Lord of the Rings, medieval Northern Europe was already a popular inspiration for fantasy settings. After all, when the average British or American person thought about tales of magic and adventure, at the top of their mind would have been the Arthurian romances, or the Norse sagas, or the Brothers Grimm. And naturally, this is what they emulated in their own settings. But there's also tropes that we can definitively pin on The Lord of the Rings. Elves and dwarves did appear in some of the earlier books, but Tolkien definitely played a huge role in defining the way we see them in modern fantasy. Meanwhile, conflict between the cosmic forces of good and evil doesn't really come up in any of these stories besides, of all of them, the Nightland. And also, the stakes are never apocalyptic. In none of these books are we ever told that if the hero fails, then it'll be the literal end of the world. But in the development of fantasy as a genre, I think there's two really big things that make Tolkien stand out compared to his predecessors. The first is what we've already discussed in terms of hard world building. The idea of not just using this fantasy setting as a stage for the story to take place in, but actually fleshing out its history, its cultures, its languages, until it becomes a fully realized sub-creation. No previous fantasy writer came even remotely close to doing this on the same scale as Tolkien, and with that, he truly rose the bar of what was possible in the genre. The second factor is his sheer level of commercial success and popular influence. All of the books that we've gone over are quite obscure. Even Dunsany and Cabell, who might have had some degree of fame at the beginning of the 20th century, fell out of favor during the Great Depression and the Second World War. It was only the massive success of The Lord of the Rings that convinced publishers to bring them back into print in the 1960s and 1970s, and that's pretty much the sole reason why anyone remembers these books today. And so, it would seem that it's for good reason that Tolkien is remembered as the founder of the fantasy genre. Sure, there were authors before him who were doing something similar, but for better or worse, we don't have much in the way of Worm Ouroboros imitators. It would seem that all of the books that we've gone over today were essentially failed prototypes, that they had no real influence, and the modern fantasy genre is entirely descended from Tolkien. But this video is only part 1 of 2, so you know it's not that simple. After all, there's plenty of tropes and conventions in modern fantasy that don't have any origin in The Lord of the Rings. If you think back to that stereotypical Dungeons & Dragons style fantasy setting, there's obviously lots of stuff that were taken from Tolkien, but if you actually dig into it, there's far more elements that have no basis at all in his legendarium. And a lot of that stuff descends from what we'll talk about in part 2. We've had a look at literary fantasy, so next up we'll talk about the concurrent tradition of fantasy that sprung up in pulp magazines. But in the meantime, if you stuck around this long, you must find this subject pretty interesting. So while you wait for part 2, make sure to take a look through the bibliography that I linked in the description. And if you've listened up to this point, I know you have some free time on your hands, so if you weren't already planning on it, why not read one of these books yourself? Almost all of them are in the public domain, so you can read them online for free. And if your excuse is that you don't have time to read, and you just listen to YouTube videos while you do the chores, then you can go to LibriVox and download a free public domain audiobook recording. And once you've done that, I want you to go to the comment section and tell me something I missed. I want you to tell me something that I got wrong. If there's a book that you think belonged in this video but I didn't get around to, I want you to give your own explanation of it. I don't regard myself as the be-all, end-all expert on this subject. My goal is to spark a conversation. In fact, if the comment section doesn't end up being filled with people calling me a hack and a fraud, I will be sorely disappointed.